Yeah, thank you so much for being flexible. I know we're in the lower gym and it might be familiar to some of us. We do some special occasions down here like Good Friday and Christmas, but we will be here for most of the summer. And then just a reminder, the best place to park would be underground. It's just easier that way to get into the elevator. We don't know what the main floor will look like week to week. Especially if you have younger kids, it might be just safer that way, or if you have things to bring in or strollers, might be better to park down there, but up to you. We're gonna try to keep that door open that you may have entered through from street level. If you're coming from street level, I think we said the back doors by the field. Today we decided not to do that, so I'm sorry for those that live in the neighborhood and tried to access that. The doors between the cage parkade and the main entrance, the hallway where the stairs are, that door was open this morning. We're just gonna try to do that so that everything's more at the front of the school. And it may change if we have to. We'll see how things go. We're kind of at the mercy of the construction throughout the summer. So thank you for being flexible. I hope you're all having a good summer so far. A lot of our youth are away today at retreat, so we're excited for them and all that's happening for them. So we started our longer Old Testament series for the year last week on the book of Exodus. And if we haven't met before, by the way, my name's Andrew. I'm part of the team here. So we're going to continue that series on Exodus this morning. We'll start with a recap. So last year, we went through the book of Genesis, if anyone was here and remembers that, which had the themes of God's creation, his blessing, the fall of man, and God's covenant. And then with Exodus, the second book of the Bible, the themes are God's deliverance, God's revelation, and Israel's unbelief and rebellion. So Exodus means a going out or mass departure of a large number of people leaving. We may have heard this term before. And later on, we will come to the departure of the Israelites from Egypt under the leadership of Moses and see God's gracious deliverance of his chosen Israelite people from Egyptian slavery. So last week in Exodus 1, Phil took us through that chapter, and we moved forward from the story of Joseph at the end of Genesis to a new generation and a new Pharaoh or king in Egypt who felt threatened because the Israelite people were so numerous. God was blessing them in numbers more and more, and there was this worry that they could overpower the Egyptians, that they would join their enemies and fight against them and leave the country. So he enforces hard labor upon the Israelites with slave masters, and they're forced to build 2 store cities for Pharaoh, where supplies and provisions were stored. But the more they were oppressed, the more the Israelites grew in number and multiplied. And this further intensified how ruthlessly the Egyptians made them work, making their lives difficult with all kinds of work in the fields. And Pharaoh wanted to further weaken the Israelites by telling the Hebrew midwives, we might remember this if we were here last week, their names were Shiphrah and Puah, to kill any baby boys that were being delivered and to let the baby girls live. However, because of the faith of the women in God, they did not do what the king of Egypt told them to do, and they let the boys live. So in another attempt or a third plan to weaken the Israelite people, Pharaoh told them to throw every Hebrew boy into the Nile River. And so Exodus 1 showed us that God's blessing of continuing to add to the number of Israelites, it actually brought more opposition and oppression. And we learned that the more that we are oppressed, the more we will thrive because God is with us. The Israelites continue to grow in number despite being persecuted and oppressed. And we see how the faith and strength of the women of Israel are underestimated. And this was my favorite point from last week that stood out, how God used the women. So he blessed these midwives because of their obedience to him and not to Pharaoh. So he completely underestimated the strength of the Israelite women, and he was targeting the men. So that's the beginning of the book of Exodus, and today we're introduced to who Moses is, his origin story before he came to lead Israel. In Exodus 2, we will see God's providence and protection in the life of Moses from the very beginning, the courage of his mother to entrust him to God, and we will see how God takes care of Moses and prepares him to be ready. before God calls him to lead his people out of Egypt. So we can turn our Bibles to Exodus 2. It's also going to be up here on the screen. We're going to read Exodus 2, the whole thing first. And we start with the birth of Moses and then his escape to Midian. Exodus 2. It reads, "Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. 'This is one of the Hebrew babies,' she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?' 'Yes, go,' she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you.' So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, 'I drew him out of the water.' One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, 'Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?' The man said, 'Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'What I did must have become known.' When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, 'Why have you returned so early today?' They answered, 'An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock.' 'And where is he?' Reuel asked his daughters. 'Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat.' Moses agreed to stay with a man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, 'I have become a foreigner in a foreign land.' During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So we can look at Exodus 2 here as 3 acts. We're going to break them down. Act 1 being God's deliverance of Moses, or his rescue. Act 2 as Moses attempting to rescue his own people on his own timeline and on his own terms. And Act 3 as Moses becoming a foreigner. So again, at the end of Exodus 1, we read about this decree from Pharaoh calling for the death of Hebrew baby boys. And it is during this exact time that Moses is born. So the parents of Moses, they come from this tribe of Levi. They meet and they marry, and his mother becomes pregnant and gives birth to him, a baby boy, at this time when Pharaoh wants all Hebrew baby boys to be thrown into the Nile River. The timing is not coincidental, that at the same time this cruel law was made for the murder of all male children of the Hebrews, many Hebrew boys probably perished. Moses is born into this time of turmoil and danger for Hebrew boys. And we see in this first act that God will prevail, and he's more powerful than any king or ruler in the world, and that he delivers Moses from the danger of death, and he will not allow anything to ruin his plan for Moses to use him to rescue the Israelite people from Egypt. And this happens here, as we just read, with key people defying the Pharaoh's commands. The midwives and now Moses' family, of course, not wanting their baby boy to perish. We see here that the first act of courage in the book of Exodus, which is full of courageous deeds, is the courage of a mother, her family, and her midwives in saving her child. The courage of people who feared the Lord and sought to follow him in difficult circumstances. In the toughest circumstances, God calls us to fear and follow God and find our courage in him. In all circumstances, really. And out of this courage and fear to follow God and not Pharaoh, God keeps Moses safe from birth, where he's nurtured by his family, and his mother hides him for 3 months. Can you imagine what it would be like to have to give birth to a newborn boy, and amidst caring for him, to hide him 24/7 for 3 months in fear of being found out and having baby boy thrown into the river? Innocent baby boys essentially being killed because Pharaoh felt threatened by them, by baby boys who he thought would grow up to be strong men that could conquer Egypt. The anguish of having to keep the baby hidden daily in order to keep him alive. Incredibly scary to be living in oppression in a foreign land, to be raising a family and faced with this threat. She hid him while caring for him, feeding him. She must have been exhausted taking care of a newborn, and after 3 months, she could no longer hide him. Maybe Egyptian officials were going around checking to see if any baby boys were being hidden. Imagine the stress and the worry that Moses would be found and taken away from the family and thrown into the river. This happens again and again later in history, doesn't it? With people hiding, people needing to hide, children included, because of ethnic cleansing, mass persecution. We can think of Jewish people hiding from the Nazis during the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, indigenous parents hiding their children to keep them from being taken away and put into residential schools. Different groups throughout history being targeted, trying to hide and escape harm. Most recently, we have Ukraine and Russia. We have Israel and Palestine, all around the world. Just horrifying. So we can imagine there's already so much fear and sorrow that comes with being seen as less than because of who you are and what you look like, being classified as a foreigner or a minority, and to not feel welcomed or wanted. That is what the Israelites were facing daily as displaced people in a foreign land, and now to experience the killing of all their baby boys. Moses' mother could not hide him any longer, and she had no choice. So she put him in a basket and coated it to make the basket more sturdy and waterproof, and she placed him in the Nile River. She had no choice but to trust God with what she had no control over. And his sister stands at a distance to see what would happen to him. All they could do was float him down the Nile River and trust that God would continue to protect him. How are we learning to trust God today? What are we sending down the Nile River today? Or what should we be sending down as an act of faith to say, yes, God, I trust you. I know you are with me. I know what you want is best for me, and I release my fear over this particular situation or area in my life. Is it our studies, our career path, starting a family, raising a family, relationships, illness, whatever we may be worried about, anxious, stressed, concerned about, that we cannot control, our hopes and dreams that we so desperately desire and wish for? What do we need to send down the Nile River today and let go of, to wait on God for? Can we do that? Can we look back to times where we have placed something in God's hands and seen him deliver us, rescue us, comfort us, figure things out for us, execute his plan for us, and bless us? Where have we seen in the past in our lives that he cares for us and he is good? Putting Moses into the river was a huge risk. If he was simply left to lie there in the basket floating, A lot of different things could have happened. At some point, he would have probably gotten hungry, starved, or perhaps a predator like a crocodile in the Nile River would come along and devour him. Or maybe another Egyptian would see him in the river and drown him in order to follow Pharaoh's orders. But Moses' mother and sister must have known that Pharaoh's daughter does bathe in the Nile River and timed it, hopefully, to put Moses in there at the time she came down and close to where she would be. They wanted him to be found, and it was known that the women of the town would be there washing their clothes or bathing. So this would be their best shot to save Moses. And of course, Pharaoh's daughter does come down and sees the basket and opens it and finds Moses. And instead of following along with what her father, Pharaoh, would have wanted, she feels sorry for Moses, who is crying. She knows he is a Hebrew baby, and yet she has the courage to go against the decree of her father. The verb here, feel sorry, is actually stronger than that. It actually means to have compassion, to pity, to spare. So she felt enough compassion, strong enough for her to spare Moses, strong enough for her to defy the orders of her father, the king. And we can almost hold our breath again here along with Moses' family as his sister steps in to ask Pharaoh's daughter if she needs a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. They were banking on the fact that it wouldn't make sense for an Egyptian woman, especially the princess, to take on the task of nursing a foreigner's baby. So she quickly steps in from where she was watching, a short distance away, doing her part to save her baby brother. And thankfully, the Pharaoh's daughter says yes. And of course, Moses' sister brings his own mother, and Moses is given back to the family, and they are paid to nurse and raise Moses. This plan of Pharaoh's is just completely destroyed because now the resources of Egypt are being used to raise and train the one who would eventually break the power of the Egyptian kingdom over the Israelite people. Pharaoh's daughter was paying them with resources from Egypt. And the Pharaoh who wanted to destroy the people of God was now becoming, it's kind of funny, the adoptive grandfather of Moses. And the irony here is so significant. What is incredible is that Pharaoh wants to weaken Israel by targeting the men. And this point comes back from last week. God uses and imparts wisdom and impresses his plan upon the women, who are often overlooked, looked down upon, and seen as less significant. The midwives, Moses' mother and sister, and Pharaoh's daughter, all working together basically to save the future leader of Israel. And this passage truly highlights that the women are not forgotten, but in fact used to do amazing things for God's glory. God can and will use each of us to do amazing things for his glory. He wants to use us to do great things for him. He has a plan for each of us from before we were even born. And it is beautifully gracious here that Moses was given back to his mother for a time at least before she would have to bring him back to Pharaoh's daughter. The life-changing sacrifice of his mother and family in order for Moses to survive. The context suggests that Moses was brought back when he was weaned and before he was named, so he could have been around 3 or 4 years old. And Pharaoh's daughter names him Moses, which means one born of water. In Hebrew, the name means to draw out, which is what happened to Moses. He was drawn out of the water and rescued from the water of the Nile. And there's a foreshadowing here that he will draw the Hebrew people out of Egypt through the water, the Red Sea. His name indicates the significant role he would play in Israel's history. So this is Act 1 of God's deliverance of Moses, where we see how God is at work in saving Moses. And now we come to Act 2 and 3, where Moses tries to rescue his people his own way, and he leaves everything behind and flees Egypt to a place called Midian. We skip ahead now to Moses at around age 40. As the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, Moses enjoys the highest privileges in his education. He's been raised in the comfort and safety of Egyptian royalty. And now, for some reason, he chooses to go out. It says here to where his own people were and watch them at their hard labor. Was he oblivious to this all these years, unaware? Maybe he didn't step out. For some reason, he decides to step out of the sheltered environment he grew up in and go out to see where the common people were, specifically where the Hebrew people were, enslaved in hard labor. And Moses, despite being raised amongst Egyptian people, identifies himself with God's people. He knows that he is not Egyptian, and he realizes what his people had been through all these years, which he had been spared from. And he pitied them, and he felt burdened for them, and he wanted to help and seek justice for them. And sadly, he secretly kills the Egyptian that is beating the Hebrew and hides him. Maybe he didn't plan on actually killing the man, but Moses sought to free the Israelites with his own plan. He resorted to something sinful and his own strength. He didn't exercise restraint of his anger. His anger got the best of him. And his reactive, impulsive, out of control response showed that he was not ready to lead the people. He was ignoring the anger that was within him, and it just blew up. I wonder if there's anything that we are ignoring under the surface of our lives that could blow up badly if we do not deal with it, that could prevent us from experiencing God's plan for us. What's going on for us underneath the surface? Moses took matters into his own hands, and he actually made it worse. This wasn't God's way for him, and it ended in disaster. To exert human effort to do what he thought was justice, to act out of his own flesh and wisdom. And now when he tries to make peace between two of his fellow Hebrews fighting, he isn't taken seriously. He was found out by his fellow Hebrews, and they knew he had killed this Egyptian and hid it. He has no authority. The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was trying to do things his way, and it backfired. What are we doing our own way instead of God's way? What are we doing out of our own strength and wisdom? What do we need to ask God to help us with, backed by his strength and his wisdom? God had to teach Moses that he shouldn't trust in his own ability, but to rely on God's strength and strategy. That he was not to give himself authority, but to submit in obedience to God's authority. And it was not his time yet to rescue his people from oppression. Moses was rescued by God, and now in his own attempt to rescue one of his people, it turned out badly, and he had to flee Egypt because Pharaoh wanted to kill him. What has happened when we have tried to take matters into our own hands instead of waiting on God to speak or act? In what area of our lives is God wanting to transform us today? How does he want to prepare us to grow, to be who he intended for us to be? Because of what he did, Moses had to run away and leave everything behind. Imagine the identity crisis he faced. A Hebrew boy born into an oppressive environment in Egypt, raised for a few years with his own family, given back to his family, forced to leave his family, and then adopted by Egyptian royalty, raised with all of those privileges, trying to come back to his own roots, wrestling with his identity as an outsider among his own people, and at the same time as an outsider because he was not Egyptian, only to try and take things into his own hands and then having to run. He had to withdraw instead and wait on God's timing and settle in Midian, and his life suddenly changed forever. So Moses goes to live in Midian, and he runs away, and he comes across the daughters of a priest who came to draw water for their father's flock. And the shepherds came to drive them away, but Moses came to their rescue and helps water their flock. We can already see that Moses wanted to deliver others from harm. This was the third time that he sought to protect people. He had this heart to defend those in need. And he's invited to go to the home of this priest, Ruel, and his daughters, agrees to stay with him, and he marries one of Ruel's daughters, Zipporah. And they have a son named Gershom, which means foreigner, because Moses had become a foreigner. And Moses would not return to Egypt for another 40 years. He felt exiled and banished. But God's plan for him didn't stop here. God kept him safe and sheltered him because he was wanted in Egypt. God provided a hiding place for him. He provided a family for him in Midian. He learned how to be a shepherd and keep the flock of his father-in-law and how to lead his family. He went from having royal privilege in Egypt to being humbled for 40 years, learning what it was like to live a life of communion with God, to live a quieter life. And during that period, the king of Egypt that wanted to kill him died. And so the Israelites, they still continued to be enslaved during this time, and they were crying out for help to God because of this, because of their continued bondage in Egypt. Another Pharaoh came to power and rose up in his place, still cruel to Israel like his predecessor. The oppression continued. And so the chapter ends with an emphasis on what God was doing. His response to the affliction of Israel was that he heard their groaning. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob to bless the Israelites and their descendants and make them a great nation. And he looked upon them and was concerned about them. God heard, remembered, saw them, and understood. He knew how much they were suffering. The end of the passage reminds us that God will not forget about us and that he does hear our prayers. He has sympathy and compassion for his people, and he is near to those in need. He was paying attention to the Israelites, and he had a plan to rescue them at the right time. He had already chosen the one who would deliver them. And although Moses had failed and had sinned, God graciously and sovereignly will still bring ultimate blessing upon his chosen people. He will still use Moses. And God's plan would come to fruition because of what God had done, what he had orchestrated, and what he was about to do. God was still present. He was doing something, and he was going to do more. He will continue to weave his story throughout the history of his people. He had not forgotten his people. I wonder if some of us here today need to hear, or we're feeling that maybe God has forgotten about us. Maybe there's something that we're wrestling with and we feel like God hasn't been present. He has not been speaking into our lives in this area. But I wonder if we can redirect that and remember how God has shown us that he has been present in our lives, and to remember that he still is present in our lives and he has not forgotten about us. To summarize, God counteracts Pharaoh's cruelty with the birth of Moses, who will deliver the Israelites from Egypt. The marriage of Moses' parents, his birth, his hiding, the positioning of his sister, and the compassion of Pharaoh's daughter, it all ignore the decree of Pharaoh, or it works around it to preserve the life of Moses. And Moses survives because of the Lord's protection and deliverance and how everything worked out. His childhood experience was traumatic, born into a highly unsafe and volatile environment for children, for all Israelites. He had to be abandoned by his mother to keep him alive as a baby. He was reunited with his family only to be returned to his adoptive family later on. While Pharaoh was trying to control the number of the Israelites through genocide, God was preparing the one who would set them free. And Moses was raised in this pagan environment and taken care of well as the adopted son of the royal princess, but prohibited from living and worshiping with his family and his fellow Hebrews and practicing the traditions of his own heritage. He lived between two worlds and was not fully at home in either place. A very difficult situation for any child to be raised in, and even harder to come to grips with as an adult. He could follow the path marked for him by Pharaoh's daughter, or identify with his own people, and he chooses his own people. But it does not go well, and he's forced to run away from the threat of being killed by Pharaoh. And then he settles in Midian, far from where the painful parts of his life had occurred, far away from where he made his greatest mistake so far, and he was given these 40 years to be transformed. A lot of time, space, privacy, and solitude. He was able to learn who he really was underneath and who he was in God's eyes before he could go and accomplish what God set out for him to do. God was preparing his servant, the one he would use to lead his people out of their oppression, to exit Egypt and to find freedom from a foreign land, from slavery and forced labor. And he was humbling and training Moses for 40 years, until Moses was 80, if you do the math. And the Israelites, meanwhile, continued to suffer in slavery, and God heard their cries of distress, and he had compassion on them. And what was most important was that God wanted them to know who he was. He wanted them to trust him, to understand what it meant to worship him, follow him, and be in a relationship with him. So we will see throughout Exodus examples of how God shows his people who he is and how he is present for them. And we will learn next week about how Moses is called to become this deliverer and leader of his people. So we have some discussion questions here, or reflection questions. What do you need to send down the Nile River as a courageous act of faith and trust in God? Can you think of a time before where you let go and trusted God? How did he rescue you and bless you? What is the transformation work God is trying to do in us right now beneath the surface? How can we take responsibility to address the inner bondage, unhealthy patterns, and coping strategies we might have? What do we need to do God's way and with his strength instead of our own? How can we align ourselves with what God wants us to do? And do we feel like God has forgotten about us? How has God shown us that he has been present in our lives? And we have this from last week as well. As we go on this journey through Exodus, there's these metaphors here that Phil mentioned from this book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, by Ruth Haley Barton. And these are just the different stages we might be in on our journey, trying to find freedom in Christ, journeying from salvation to finding your true home in heaven, journeying where God is calling you to greater freedom in a particular area of your life, journeying where God is calling you to leave familiar territory behind so that you can enter into something new. So something we can reflect on as we go through this series. All right, let's pray. Lord Jesus, we just humbly come before you today. Would you help us find the courage to trust you for the things we cannot control? Would you help us to step out in faith and remember how you have rescued us and blessed us throughout our lives? Lord, would you do your work inside of us, that our ways and our wishes would align with yours? Would you make us whole and equip us? And may we desire to be in deep relationship with you, Lord, and find comfort in knowing that you see and remember everything, and you have not forgotten about us. You have been present all along. Pray for each person here and their spiritual journey and where they are. May we find our freedom, identity, and purpose in you. Amen.